I sometimes wonder if we really, truly understand what the word old means. For example, I grew up in a central Illinois town that had old buildings, but it turns out it was only founded in the 1860s. Moving out to New England changed my perception of what old actually means. Here we have houses that are close to 400 years old. There's a graveyard about 100 yards from my office window that has tombstones that are older than 95% of this country. And if you go to the UK or Europe, that perception is challenged even more. We always think the things around us are old until we discover stuff that's even older. Honestly, it never fails. The oldest mummy ever discovered in Egypt was the body of a woman named Lady Rye. Archaeologists believe that she was about 30 years old when she died over 3,500 years ago, and her remains have given scientists a great window into the past. And for a century and a half, she has represented a watermark. Until now, that is. In late January of 2023, Egyptian archaeologists announced that they had found the mummy of a man who was buried 800 years before Lady Rye, way back in 2300 BC. And it's a discovery that proves yet again that there's always something older, just waiting to be discovered. Some things feel old simply because we've known about them our entire lives. But for those who know where to look, even the oldest things, like the stories we tell, are hiding an even more ancient origin. And as is so often the case, the further we dive into the past, the more darkness we uncover. I'm Aaron Mankey, and this is Lore. It's the well from which so many stories have been pulled. Young adult novels, television shows, movies, and comic books, all of them on a pretty regular basis, have lowered their buckets into the depths to pull up a fresh take on an old story. Fairy tales. Of course, Disney is probably the biggest example that comes to mind. Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, Snow White. These are all stories that existed long before their animators set pen to paper. But just how long before might surprise you. That classic story, Beauty and the Beast, according to some scholars, can be traced all the way back to a world before English, French, and Italian were even a thing. Researchers Drs. Sarah Grassa da Silva and Jamshid J. Tarani published a paper a few years ago that followed the tale back as far as 6,000 years. Think about that for a moment. We consider Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, for example, as a classic, and yet it's only a century and a half old. I'm not sure my brain can even classify Beauty and the Beast. A tale as old as time, indeed. There are others too. The story of Rumpelstiltskin might be just as old, and there's a 5,000-year-old fairy tale known as The Boy Who Stole the Ogre's Treasure, which we would immediately recognize as Jack and the Beanstalk. Now, I think all of us understand how the evolution of these tales worked, right? Over all the centuries, for most of the time, the stories were being passed on by word of mouth. The versions that we have today are mostly the work of curators, like Frenchman Charles Perrault and, a century later, the Grimm brothers. But they did more than just write these tales down. They changed them. Perrault was a master at this. He loved to add in a key iconic element to each of his stories. Remember Little Red Riding Hood? Well, she didn't have a red hood until Charles Perrault got a hold of her story in the 1690s. Before then, she was just a girl with no identity. Perrault's addition helped make her identifiable. A century later, the Grimm brothers nicely added the bit where the huntsman saves her by cutting her out of the wolf's stomach, which means that for centuries, perhaps thousands of years, Little Red Riding Hood was simply a terrifying story of an unnamed little girl who gets eaten by a wild animal. The end. And how about Snow White? Well, in the oldest version of that story, the woman who wants to kill her is her own mother, not her stepmother, which somehow feels darker, doesn't it? And when the Grimms got a hold of her tale, the evil queen becomes her stepmother, but is also a cannibal, requesting that a huntsman bring her the liver and the lungs of Snow White so that she can eat them. Oh, and if that wasn't dark enough for you, the Grimm version also features a very dead Snow White, not just sleeping, dead. And yet when the prince discovers her body, he tells his men that he wants to bring it home anyway for, romantic purposes, shall we say. On the way home, they accidentally drop her coffin, and when her body hits the ground, a piece of the poisoned apple gets dislodged from her throat, and she comes back to life. I imagine that was an awkward moment for the two of them. One last example, The Little Mermaid. Now that one was written down by Hans Christian Andersen and has that well-known magical moment where she trades her voice for a pair of human legs. But most people forget that that deal comes with two conditions. First, every step she takes on those legs will be unbearably excruciating. And second, if the prince ever marries a different woman, the mermaid will turn into sea foam and die. And then Andersen goes on to show us how the mermaid dances for the prince to earn his attention, something that must have been absolute torture for her to do. And in the end, he marries someone else, at which point the mermaid explodes in a cloud of foam. Happy ending? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. And that's the thing about these tales. Few of them truly ever are happy stories. Today we see fairy tales as little bite-sized children's stories that teach heartwarming moral lessons. But centuries ago, they were something more, something darker. And yet the darkest of them all is a fairy tale on a whole other level. Not just because it's bloody and violent, but because where it comes from as well. It's a story pulled from the pages of real life. Many of you already know the basic story, but let's review it anyway, just in case. It's another gem written down by our good friend Charles Perrault as part of a collection that he published in 1697, and it's called Bluebeard. The story introduces us to a young woman who marries a wealthy nobleman from the area. He's got a blue beard, too, which was a Charles Perrault addition. After their wedding, the couple returned to Bluebeard's massive manor house, and everything seems good and fine. Well, except for the rumor that Bluebeard's previous wives had all mysteriously disappeared. Well, then one day he needs to make a trip, and he hands the keys to the manor to his new wife. "Explore," he tells her. "Go enjoy the luxury I've surrounded you with." But he does have one small condition. The closet door at the end of the Great Hall is off limits. "Open any door you want," he tells her, "except that one. If she does, he'll be sure to punish her." And you know how this is going to play out, right? Bluebeard leaves, she goes exploring, and she's never really satisfied until she sees what's behind that forbidden door. Perhaps it's treasure. Maybe it's like Monica's closet on Friends, and that's where he puts all of his mess and chaos. She just wants to know. Upon opening the door, though, she discovers the bodies of all of his previous wives hanging from hooks in the ceiling, with pools of blood all over the floor. In her fright, she drops the key to the room, and when she picks it up, she notices that there's blood on it. No problem, right? She can just clean it. Well, she tries, but she's never able to get all of the blood off. And then Bluebeard returns home. He inspects the key and spots the blood, like some medieval CSI expert. And naturally, he gets very upset and is about to kill her when, surprise, surprise, her brothers burst the door in and rescue her, killing him instead. Now, Charles Perrault, of course, added a moral lesson at the end, as he was known to do. But true to the social values of the late 17th century, that lesson is not, "Hey people, don't kill your wives." Instead, he writes a long-winded version of the phrase, "Hey wives, don't be nosy." Yeah. Now, a lot of people think that the roots of this story can actually be found in the mid-6th century, in a region of northwestern France called Brittany. That's where a man named Connemore the Cursed ruled over the people, allegedly by killing the previous king and taking the throne for himself. Time and folklore has sort of muddled our information about Connemore, but we know that he was a real actual person, and he had a reputation for cruelty. Remember that king that he killed? It said that Connemore forced the man's widow to marry him, and then treated her and her son so horribly that they were forced to escape and run away. Yeah, nice guy, right? But the really famous bit is the story about how he ended up marrying Tryphene, the daughter of the Count of Van. Now, initially, Connemore simply asked, but Tryphene's father refused. So the king invaded the Count's land, and then the Count caved. Connemore rode home with a new wife, and Tryphene lost her freedom. And soon enough, she was pregnant. But she was also starting to hear rumors about Connemore that frightened her. Specifically that he killed his 4 previous wives, while they were pregnant. In one version of the story, she even stumbled upon a room full of macabre trophies taken from those dead wives, and the ghost of one of them warns her to run for her life. So she does. Only Connemore manages to catch her. Now, in some versions of the story, this happened after she gives birth to a son, and in others, she's still very pregnant. Either way, Connemore kills both of them, just as he had done to all of his other wives. Tryphene, for her part, would go on to become the patron saint of sickly children and overdue babies. That's about as happy an ending as we can expect, given the circumstances. But Connemore, according to many historians, gains a darker reputation. He, too, goes down in history as a symbol of a bigger concept. But for him, that concept is murder and abuse. And we might never know for sure if his story truly is the origin of the Bluebeard legend, but the glass slipper certainly seems to fit. I'd even go as far as to consider the case solved and closed, if it wasn't for one more possibility. And as hard as it might be to believe, this one is even darker. He was born rich. His father had been given the title of Baron de Ray by the final member of the de Ray bloodline, and along with it came a whole lot of money. Throw in an also rich mother, and little Gilles was set for life. But around 1415, when he was just 9 years old, that wonderful world fell apart when both of his parents died. Gilles packed up and was sent to live with his maternal grandfather, Jean de Cron, and that's where he grew up. He was highly educated. He wanted for nothing, and as a result, quickly gained a reputation for being a little narcissistic and reckless. Life moved pretty fast for young Gilles de Rais. He was betrothed at the age of 13, but that didn't end up working out. At 16, he went to war in a conflict between two noble families, serving, luckily, for the winning side. And at 17, he finally did get married, this time to a cousin who he kidnapped with his grandfather's permission. I know, not the best family life, right? Oh, and that cousin, it turns out, was insanely rich. In fact, through that marriage, Gilles becomes the wealthiest nobleman in the entire country. Money that he spent with abandon on parties, artwork, more and more homes, and his own private army. He even funded the production of a play that he wrote himself, paying the actors and the musicians to follow him wherever he traveled. At the young age of 18, he was invited to spend a year at the royal court and quickly became a general and a commander. And it was during his time there that he earned a new reputation, that of cruelty. For example, he was fond of having prisoners executed even when their crimes did not warrant such a sentence. He was just doing it for the fun of it. In 1429, when he was about 25 years old, he met a military leader who won his loyalty. It was one of those hero-worshipping situations, and Gilles was enamored. He found purpose serving under this leader, and whatever was modeled for him, he copied. Religious devotion, military might, you name it, Gilles copied his hero's every quality. It was a relationship that took him into the fray of the 100 Years' War and the Siege of Orleans. The king made him Marshal of France, and he was chosen to be one of only 4 lords who were assigned to bring the Holy Ampulla to the consecration of King Charles VII. Life was good for a while, but when his military hero was killed, he packed all of that in and headed home. With nothing to do, he threw himself into his play again. Now, I won't go into detail on it, but it's worth looking up. The production was huge and expensive, and it sucked up most of his vast wealth. But his bigger hobby was something darker. He had developed a taste for killing children. Right there in the castle that he inherited from his grandfather, Gilles de Rais worked with a handful of accomplices to lure local children into his circle and then murder them in cold blood. There are a lot of stories about what he did, how he did it, and the depths of his depravity, but that's not the sort of thing I'm going to cover here. I've got kids of my own, and these are things that I would just rather not dwell on. Just know that during this phase of his life, Gilles was reported to have killed at least 100 boys and girls, although some reports put that number closer to 700. And that's the sort of thing that can generate a storm of rumors, like a dark cloud that followed him wherever he went. In 1439, he sold one of his properties and then immediately regretted it. So he did a very reasonable thing. He raised his personal army and took it back by force. But in the process, he imprisoned an important cleric, which brought the attention of the authorities. And when they investigated his properties, you can guess what they discovered. Gilles de Rais was arrested on September 13th of 1440 for the crimes of child murder and occult violence. And rather than confess under torture, he freely admitted to all of it. He was proud of his unspeakable deeds. It gave him pleasure, he said. The only thing he regretted, it seems, was that he had to stop. His sentence was sort of complex. He was to be both hanged and burned, something usually done when they didn't want the criminal to suffer through the burning. Although it's also easy to see it as a sort of statement. What you did was so evil, they seem to say, that you deserve to be killed twice. Except their plan failed. Apparently, Gilles had enough supporters that after his hanging, they rushed the platform and took down his body, giving him a chance at a normal burial. All of this for a man who claimed to feel genuine pleasure, he told them, for the torture, blood, and tears of children. Our favorite stories are often older than we think. Maybe that's why they are our favorites, because they've stood the test of time. They've evolved to reflect the world that we live in and have been refined and shaped by every retelling to become pure storytelling devices. Maybe it's also important to point out that no single person can claim to own these tales. Sure, some have put their own spin on them, like the candy-coated versions that Disney sells us. But at the root of all of them is an older, more brutal core, a word-of-mouth shadow that has cast darkness over the hearts of people for thousands of years. In a way, the idea of a happy ending is a gaudy add-on that spits in the face of the originals. But light or dark, the stories have always been, and always will be, a place where we might learn a lesson or two. Just like the story of Gilles de Rais. After his execution and rescue by his disillusioned fans, his name took on a life of its own. He became a sort of boogeyman used by parents to frighten children into good behavior. In France, his name became practically synonymous with Satan, and eventually even spawned new, darker tales. And as some might claim, one of those stories was even the fairy tale of Bluebeard. Oh, and that military leader that Gilles de Rais worshipped and imitated for a short while, they went on to become the centerpiece of their own stories too, whispered by people everywhere. And who could blame them? After all, it's not often that a military figure like that comes along, and is also a woman. That's right, the devil himself, Gilles de Rais, served as the personal bodyguard and champion in arms to the legendary French saint, Joan of Arc. I hope you enjoyed today's deep dive into the ancient roots of our most beloved fairy tales. It's fascinating just how old they really are, and how much they've changed over the centuries to become the stories that we hold so dearly today. To that end, I've got one more classic to unpack for you. Stick around through this brief sponsor break, and I'll tell you all about it. Like a lot of these ancient fairy tales, there's a lot of guesswork built into the efforts of scholars today. They compare stories across cultures and time, and look at how certain details remain preserved or changed as the centuries passed by. Sometimes that leads to one definitive source, but most of the time it just highlights an incredibly powerful truth, that we as humans seem to be drawn to telling certain kinds of stories, and that causes them to appear in multiple places in the ancient world, seemingly at the same time. The one I want to share with you right now, though, is well known throughout China and tells us about a young woman named Yaxiang, who was the daughter of a local chieftain. In the story, though, the girl's father dies unexpectedly, leaving her in the care of his widow, her stepmother. But between the woman's cruel behavior toward her and her jealous stepsister Qing Li, poor young Yaxiang began to suffer horribly. She had gone from a life of privilege to poverty in a heartbeat, and as a result was forced to work for the others as a servant. She did have one little escape, though, a magic fish who could talk to her, giving her one true friend in a world of darkness and suffering. We learn later on that this fish is a spirit guide sent to Earth by her dead mother to protect and teach her, and for a while, that's exactly what happens. But then her stepmother discovers the magic fish, and being a cruel woman, has it killed so that she and Qing Li can eat it, which, as you might imagine, was devastating for our hero, Yaxiang. But then she gets a small glimmer of hope. An ancestral spirit shows up and tells her that if she could gather up the fish's bones and place them in 4 corners of her bedroom, the magic fish would still work, allowing her to have any wish granted that she might desire. So Yaxiang does exactly that, although to be fair, I have to wonder about the smell that she had to put up with. Fishy odors aside, the spell works, and she is once again able to talk with her friend, the magic fish. And then, when the new year approached, Yaxiang made a very specific wish, to be able to attend the upcoming festival, complete with a dazzling outfit and golden slippers. The magic fish gives her what she asks for, and after dressing up in her new fancy clothes, Yaxiang heads to the festival to party with everyone else. Except while she's there, she spots her stepmother and stepsister. She freaks out that she might get caught and punished, and so she runs away from the party. But not before losing one of those nice golden slippers, of course. Little does she know, the king has come into possession of that shoe, and he is so intrigued by its tiny size and beautiful construction that he puts it on public display, hoping that the shoe's true owner might come forward. Yaxiang eventually does, and manages to convince the king that the slipper is hers. To prove it, she tries it on right there in front of him. Immediately, he marries her and makes her his queen, and together they, you guessed it, live happily ever after. And it's a story that I really don't need to dissect for you, do I? You probably recognize all the major bones of the story. The young woman who's lost her father, the step-family that abuses her, and the magical assistance that leads her to a grand celebration and a lost shoe. It's Cinderella, but it's not, all at the same time. Because this isn't just a Chinese interpretation of the story that we've all grown up with. In fact, this story came about long before Disney gave us the animated classic, and before Drew Barrymore helped us to see the character in a new light. No, the tale of Yaxiang is far older. It has its roots in ancient China, during the years between the Qing and Han dynasties, which span the centuries from roughly 220 BC to 220 AD, which makes it over 2,000 years old, proving yet again that the stories we tell are often older and more diverse than we could ever imagine. Folklore might often discuss tales of people set at odds with each other, but in the end, it also does something more magical. It unites us around a common experience, that of our shared humanity. As always, folks, thank you so much for watching. Credits for today's episode are in the description below. Lore has been a podcast since 2015 with over 400 million downloads to date. You can learn more about the show, plus the book series and the television adaptation from Amazon over at lorepodcast.com. And of course, be sure to click on the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you don't miss future episodes. And if you enjoyed this one, give it a thumbs up. You can also follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Lore Podcast, all one word, and then click that follow button. And when you do, say hi. I like it when people say hi. And as always, thanks for listening.